Hello and welcome back. So when you launch Amazon EC2 instances in the cloud, you're often going to find that you need to connect your instances to other AWS services. So as an example, in this particular VPC, we have an EC2 instance sitting in a public subnet. And this EC2 instance might need to read data from an S3 bucket, or perhaps it's going to write some data to an S3 bucket. Now I know we haven't covered the simple storage service S3 yet, but it's an object-based storage system which we will cover in more detail later in the course. But for now, just understand that you can upload files such as videos, images, documents to an S3 bucket, or you can read data as well from your bucket. Now, the S3 bucket actually sits in the public space, so it's one of those public services. It's outside of your VPC. And your EC2 instance will need to authenticate to the S3 bucket. So you don't want to just allow anybody to access your data on S3. So you're going to require authentication in many cases. So in this case, the EC2 instance needs to be able to authenticate to the S3 bucket to be allowed to access the data. So how do we go about doing that? Well, there's a couple of ways. I'm going to show you one way in this lesson, and then in the next lesson, I'm going to show you a different way. And the method in the second lesson is actually going to be a more secure way, the best practice way. So what I'm going to show you now is useful information. You need to know how to do this, but at the same time, it's not necessarily the best practice way of accessing or authenticating to AWS services. So this way is that you actually install something called an access key on your EC2 instance. So access keys are configured through the command line interface, and they will provide the permissions that your S3 bucket is looking for so that you can authenticate and access data in the bucket. So you configure the access keys on your EC2 instance, and those access keys are actually associated with an IAM user account, and they will pick up whatever permissions are assigned to that user account. So for example, if the user was an administrator and the policy allowed a lot of access in AWS, then the access keys configured on the EC2 instance would allow the EC2 instance to actually get those same permissions. And it will use those permissions to then connect to the bucket. So you're not actually using the user account, you're not logging in as a user with the username and password, you're configuring the access keys on the EC2. The access keys will gain the privileges assigned to the user account from which they're created, and those permissions will then allow access to the bucket. Now, why is this insecure or less secure? Well, the reason is the access keys are stored on the EC2 instance, and if you compromise the EC2 instance, you can access those access keys, and then you can use them to gain whatever privileges are assigned to that user account. So if somebody compromised your EC2 instance, they would then be able to compromise your AWS account. So that's a bit of a concern. What we're going to do now is create some access keys for this user. We'll log into our EC2 instance, we'll configure the access keys, and I'll show you how you could then connect to a bucket. And I'll also show you why it's a less secure method, because we'll be able to see the plain text keys actually on the file system of the EC2 instance. So let's head over to the console. So I'm in the management console, and what I'm going to do is go to Services and S3. And firstly, we're going to create the bucket. So this is the container on S3 in which we're going to put a couple of objects, and then we're going to try and actually access that bucket from our EC2 instance. So I'm just going to call this bucket DCT authentication-test and click on create. And we'll learn much more about S3 later in the course. For now, what I'm going to do is I've created the bucket, which is the container, and then I'm going to put a couple of objects in it. So these are going to be a couple of files. So let's add a couple of files. And on my file system here, I have a text file and a CSV file, and I'm just going to upload those. It doesn't matter what files you use. I'm just going to upload a couple, and we're just going to try and see if we can actually see these files on the file system. So those two files are uploaded. So let's head over to Amazon EC2 now, and we're going to connect into our instance. So I'm going to click on connect, copy the connection information here, and let's head over to the command line and paste in the connection information And that's it, we're logged into our instance. So what I'm going to do is run a couple of commands. I'm going to run a command which is aws s3 ls. What this does is it uses the command line interface which is installed by default on the Amazon Linux 2 AMI. And it uses the s3 ls command. So s3 is the simple storage service where we created a bucket and uploaded our objects. And ls is just a list command, so it should show the buckets that we have in the account. So we run that command and we get this error message basically, which tells us unable to locate credentials. So it's saying to us that we don't have any information to authenticate to S3 with, and we need to provide those credentials. So it's telling us to run AWS configure. So let's run AWS configure. And now it asks for the access key ID. So we need to go and generate our access keys. Back in the console, let's head to Identity and Access Management under Security, Identity and Compliance. And in IAM, we're going to go to Users, choose our user account, click on Security Credentials, and here we have access keys. So we can create access keys by just clicking on this button here. Now the thing about access keys is you only see this information once. So you can always come back and get the access key ID, but the secret access key is generated now and it's not shown again. So to keep a record, you should download the CSV file. But take care with this information, because if anyone gets access to these, then they can do whatever you're allowed to do in your account. So in my case, I'm an administrator. So if anyone gets hold of this information, then they can gain administrative privileges to my account. And that's why I'll delete these keys before I publish the video. But for now, I'm going to literally just copy straight from here, copy the access key ID. I'm going to paste it in. It now wants the secret access key. So I've copied that, I'll paste that one in. It asks for a default region name, so I'm going to type in AP Southeast-2. And I'll just leave the default output format. You don't have to enter a default region name, but if you want to know which one you're in, then just choose wherever your EC2 instances are being deployed. So if you come back to this screen, and up in the top right hand corner, you'll find the actual region name. You might not see it now because it's behind me, but just make sure you change the region to whatever region that you're in. And if you expand that list, you'll see the actual region names. So you'll see a list that says, for instance, AP Southeast 2, which is where I am. You can see US East 1. At the bottom here, we can see EU-North-1 for Stockholm, and so on. So now that we've actually got the access keys installed on our computer, let's clear the screen, and I'm going to run that same command again, so AWS S3 ls. And this time I can see that I have a bucket. So I can see DCT authentication test. And if I want to, I can look inside the bucket by running the command AWS S3 ls. Then I type s3:// and then the name of the bucket and hit enter. And we can see the files in there as well. So we've been able to successfully authenticate, which is great. But there is an issue because we do have a potential security problem here. We've written the access keys to the file system on the EC2 instance. So anybody who compromised the EC2 instance would be able to access that information. And then in my case, because my access key will have full privileges on the account, they'll be able to do anything in my account. So we don't want that. And I'll show you where you can find this information. So if we do change directory, and then we put in this path, and then we run ls, you'll see that there's these two files here. And if I run the cat command to look inside credentials, that's a file, we'll see the access key ID, and we'll see the secret access key as well. So we can see that this information is actually stored in plain text on my file system. It's not encrypted. It's not protected in any way except that it's in my user account. So you would have to compromise the system to get access to it, or you'd need to be able to compromise my key pair in order to be able to authenticate to EC2. But if you did that, then you would have full privileges to my account. So this is a big problem. So what we're going to do is I'm going to delete these. I'm just going to delete the credentials file. So it's gone now. And if I run AWS S3 ls, then we're now unable to locate credentials, so we can't authenticate. And what we're going to do in the next lesson is look at a more secure way of authenticating to services.